All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. This is the Sociology of Youth and Religion. Okay, so on to our next topic here. Sorry about the echo, this room is a little bit empty. All right, so we're going to start here talking about religion and sexuality, specifically looking at some research that was done by Donna Freitas, who's a really good scholar, probably the person who's looked at this the most, in a book called Sex and the Soul, which is juggling sexuality and spirituality, and this is specifically on college campuses in the US. So the book's a little bit older now, going back to, I think the last time it was updated was 2015, but I think still contains some really interesting kind of insights, again, mostly in American context here, which is sort of inevitable. Americans are just much more interested in religion than Canadians are on the whole. So yeah, we're going to look at that. We're going to look at, just kind of general look at religion and sexuality, and then some more kind of specific stuff.
We're going to bracket the evangelical colleges. We're going to bracket the evangelical colleges this morning. So the findings, Catholic, private, secular, and public institutions from the surveys, the interviews, and the journals that I collected from students. So, young adults believe they are supposed to be casual about sex in college. And so 45% of the students that answer this question about what do you think your peers think about sex at college, and 36% of the students at non-religious, private, and public institutions said, my peers are too casual about sex. So they made a differentiation between everybody else and themselves. Everybody is casual about sex, but I'm not. And then just about the rest of the students said, everybody on my campus is casual about sex. So they didn't make a judgment, they just said to be at college is to be casual about sex, though many of them don't feel that way themselves. Now I'm going to tell you, so the official social contract of the hookup, it really is, it's a social contract. So one, it's anything from kissing to sex, and I mean that, anything from kissing to sex. It's a broad spectrum of sexual activity. We often assume it's casual sex or it's sexual intercourse, but it doesn't have to be. It might be, but it might not. It could be making out in the corner for 5 minutes, and the reason why is because students like a broad umbrella for what a hookup is because there's so much pressure to claim that you're a part of it. And so often hookups are a lot more innocent than they might sound because so many students, especially young men, feel like they need to be able to claim high numbers. The other thing that defines a hookup is that it's brief. Some people just assume one night stand, but it might literally just mean like 5 minutes in the bathroom. I know, very romantic, bathroom kissing. So, but definitely brief. And then the third one is the one that really trips students up. So you're not supposed to feel any emotion. You are not supposed to get attached. And so communication equals bad. So you're not supposed to communicate because if you communicate, you might actually start to care. Then the fourth unofficial one I'll add is alcohol. So many students that I talk to will say things like, without alcohol, nobody would ever get together. Without alcohol, nobody would ever kiss. So, what do college students say about their hookups? So the students who talked about their hookups from my study broke up in the following way. 41% of them talked about their hookups as making them profoundly unhappy. So they used words like, hookups make me feel unhappy, abused, sad, disgusted, duped. So a lot of sadness. And then there's these 23% who are ambivalent, and 36% who are more or less fine. And I put them almost together because there's really a fine line between the students who say they're ambivalent and the students who are just fine. And so the students who are ambivalent use the word whatever all the time, which is why I like to call them the whateverists. So they would say things like, hooking up is whatever, it's whatever, it's whatever. And so therefore they're the whateverists. And then you have this other group, they're the happiest bunch in the hookup crowd, I think, and they say that their hookups are fine. And that's it, they're fine. Not fantastic, not fabulous, but fine. And I think we often assume that a hookup is going to be this very exciting, wonderful, freeing experience of sexual intimacy where you're at a party and you see someone you think is hot and you tell your friends, look at the hot person, and then you go and you conquer the hot person and you're like, wow. And it's more like the way the students describe, you're drunk, you're at a party, you're sitting on the couch, it's 3 a.m, you're looking around. You don't know where your roommates went. You're tired. You don't know how you're getting home. You look next to you. There's this person. They look at you. You're like, all right. And so those are the fine, ambivalent sorts of hookups. Not so exciting. Which brings me to, hookups are efficient. Now let me explain that. That's not my language, that's the student's language. I remember the first time I heard that, I started hearing it a couple of years ago when a student told me, well, hookups are efficient. And I remember thinking, efficient? You mean like a vacuum cleaner? So I think, so that the students are getting, that group, that whatever's group in the middle, they're getting bigger. Students are getting more ambivalent about sex. They're getting better at the hookup contract, right? Because to not care is to be ambivalent, to be whatever about it. So hookups are efficient. And when you ask students what they mean by that, they will say, well, we're really busy. We're also overscheduled. We have such long to-do lists. We have so much to get done. Everything is go, go, go. We're always on, and everyone expects that of us. We have no time for relationships in college. We have been told by the forces that are. But we got to get our sex done, kind of like you got to get the dishes done. That's how they talk about it. And so hookups are efficient. So it's efficient sexual intimacy. So students on college campuses today, if you talk to them, they will often tell you that they believe hookups are their only option. And there's a lot of suffering in hookup culture. There's a lot of sadness. There's a lot of alienation. And the ambivalence that I see growing on college campuses around sex, I think, is a form of suffering. So I want to mention romance and dating, because in the middle of all this hookup culture and this hooking up and talking about how sad they are, or how ambivalent they are, or how efficient hookups are, if you ask students today about dating, they get all excited. And so I asked every single student for my study, so what's dating like here? Do people date in college? And I got the same answer over and over again, which was something like the following. Nobody ever dates here. People don't date any college anymore, and we're not allowed to date. But then they would finish, but I wish they would. I would totally go on a date if someone asked me, or I would ask somebody out if it wouldn't be weird. And so I heard this so often, over and over again, this, there is no dating, but I wish there would be, that I got to the point where at the end of my interviews, I wanted to tell the students, listen, I know you think that nobody ever dates here. However, when you leave this room, someone is going to be waiting to come talk to me. If you think they're cute, you should totally ask them out, because believe me, they want to date you. If they're not your type, just come back. I'm here all week. So lots and lots of interest in dating, but lots of unfulfilled dating going on. So students want to date, they feel like they're not allowed to. And the other thing, and this is both men and women, by the way, everyone assumes women want to date, men don't, but both men and women want to date, and men will tell you this behind closed doors. The other thing they yearn for is romance. So much yearning for romance. And what I learned from students was, ironically, in the middle of hookup culture, romance is very chaste. Romance is talking. It's just talking. It is talking for hours, like 5 hours. So, and not just anywhere, not like in the hall of your residence hall. So it's talking for 5 hours in a really lovely place. Like ideally there's a picnic blanket, ideally there's stars, or perhaps 100 candles lit in the room. As a former res life person, I remember thinking, but you're not in your residence hall room because you might burn the hall down. And so lots and lots of yearning for romance. And if you remember, I said that one of the things that defines a hookup is no communication, right? No connection. Well, romance to students is connection. It is knowing and being known. It's having a lavish amount of time to do that. It is just talking.
Okay, so all of this research comes out of this book, Sex and the Soul, originally published in 2008. Donna Freitas puts out a revised edition of it in 2015. Donna, is a professor. She started out at Boston University, and she's moved on now. She's at University of Notre Dame now, I believe. Really interesting book. where basically she goes and she interviews 1,230 students at 4 different college types. So evangelical colleges, right, evangelical Protestant schools that have this firm religious basis, Catholic colleges, so anything ranging from like Fordham in New York, Gonzaga in Washington State, University of Notre Dame in Illinois, from small like Gonzaga to really, really huge like University of Notre Dame. Non-religious public schools, so this would be like University of Washington, University of Ohio, basically no religious basis, and it's typically state schools. And non-religious private, so this could be anything from like really prominent ones like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all the way down to smaller ones like Oberlin or things like that. So she did interviews face-to-face with students as well as kind of online surveys. And then asked them to write an online journal of their experiences. And what she said, interestingly in the book, is that the online journals were one of the best kind of sources of data she got, because people really opened up. Like when they weren't sitting across from somebody, they didn't feel like they had to hide anything. They just wrote things in great detail. So that's the project that most of this information comes. So just to restate, what basically she says is that what she found was that hookup culture is pretty prevalent on college campuses, and that there is a kind of semi-official social contract to the hookup. So it's anything basically from kissing to sex, right? Like she said in the video, it could be making out in the corner for 5 minutes all the way down to, going home with somebody. And the kind of rationale behind this kind of setup was, she felt, kind of male oriented, that men, especially in college, still get some social status essentially from having more sexual partners. So saying I hooked up with 5 girls, whether you made out with them in the corner or whether you took them home and had sex with them, ultimately was beneficial to male kind of reputation in college. For females, not so much. They tended still to be labeled potentially sluts or whores, if they engaged in too many hookups. So they had to manage that a little bit differently. It's supposed to be brief because it's supposed to be efficient, right? I love this comparison she makes to washing the dishes, right? You just have to get sex in, right? You're just supposed to get sex in at some point in your social life because it's something that's expected out of young adults. So it's supposed to be brief and efficient. Along with efficiency, right, there's not supposed to be any drama, so you're not supposed to feel any emotions. You don't get attached. And alcohol, and typically marijuana in some other cases, is there to kind of numb your emotions, to make the hookup more feasible, right? Because a lot of people would feel really uncomfortable just making out or having sex with someone they just met on a couch at 3 a.m, and therefore basically the alcohol serves as a way of reducing social inhibition. Or marijuana is the other one that she mentions in the book quite prominently. All right, so just to kind of restate these 3 things that she says, 41% of the students that she talked to profoundly unhappy with hookup culture, right? So this is not a majority, but a significant minority of people who really don't like it. 23%, so put those two together, you get about 64%, but 23% are ambivalent, so the whateverists. Essentially, they just can't imagine another world outside of hookup culture, and then, a little bit more than a third are more or less fine with it and enjoy hookup culture. So that leaves a lot of people who are, not super happy with it, but don't really see an alternative. Now, she does say, more of that 23% who are ambivalent are drifting into the more or less fine, but that's still a lot of people who are potentially not that happy with hookup culture. So another professor who's talked about, hookup culture and some of the challenges that it presents is a lady named Carrie Cronin. And Carrie Cronin is a doctoral candidate and professor at Boston College. And she's taught a class now for several years, and they made, part of what she's been working on into a documentary called The Dating Project, which I was going to have you watch, but, then things have gone sideways on us. Basically, she teaches a class in the Religious Studies Department at Boston College on dating and spirituality. And the kind of feedback she got from students in this class ultimately spurred her to really wanting to talk about dating and the hookup culture. And she now does kind of an annual seminar for a couple hundred students at Boston College on dating and the hookup culture. So her experiences basically have taught her or suggested that most students still want relationships, but that the culture has prioritized away from that. And basically, as she tells it, right, she held this dating and spirituality class, and she had maybe a dozen students in that class. And
they would talk about it, and a lot of it was mostly female in the class, would talk about the hookups they had on the weekend and describe it. And then they went off for spring break, and they had a bunch of hookup experiences, on beaches in Panama City, or in, Cancun, or wherever it is that they ended up going for spring break. And a lot of them came back and sort of, basically, as she tells it, the girl who had sort of taken the most pride in her, many hookups during the course, said that basically she came back from spring break feeling really gross, and really used. And this sort of opened the floodgates, and the rest of the women in the class, basically from that point, all started talking about how much, they disliked hookup culture, and how much it kind of hurt them and made them feel bad. And so she's kind of taken this, and run with it, turned it into a course and a documentary. And what she says is that most people are still looking for romance, right? At the end of the day, most students would still prefer to date, but they feel that the fact that, there is this criteria of efficiency has sort of foreclosed dating to them. It's no longer really, in a sense, a live option for them. So that basically they are stuck with hookup culture. Many of them hope that hookup cultures and hookups will ultimately lead to relationships. So the kind of idea is, you start with a hookup, maybe you really like them and you hook up again, right? You become friends with benefits. And if it kind of progresses, you might catch feelings, right? And catching feelings is this weird kind of term, right? It's become a sort of pathology to catch feelings. Like, it's like a sickness. It's like catching a disease, or like, I don't know, maybe syphilis. Right, so you're catching feelings, and you see my little graphic on the side there. I'm catching feelings. This needs to stop as quickly as my diet did when I saw cheese fries. It's not a good thing, right? Because catching feelings is inefficient. The whole idea of hookup culture is that it's supposed to be really efficient. And hookup culture prioritizes that efficiency, but catching feeling something for someone, wanting a relationship with them, that's not efficient. Okay, and maybe if both people catch feelings, then they might get together and date and turn it into a real relationship. But what Cronin, and Freitas backs this up in her book, The End of Sex, her 2013 book, says is that, yeah, this rarely seems to happen. And so what ends up happening, right, is people hook up and maybe become friends with benefits, go to those multiple recurrent hookups. But then, a common experience is ghosting, right? Where people stop returning messages, just pretend the other person doesn't exist. And unfortunately, this is a pretty common phenomenon, obviously, and a new piece of vocabulary that I'm sure I didn't have to tell you what ghosting was because you all knew. But that is sort of what is happening in the world right now. So one of the things that both Freitas and Cronin talk about is that one of the biggest problems that people have in terms of dating and hookup culture is that they don't know how to date, or they're afraid of dating. And what Freitas basically notes is that dating is a social skill, right? Dating is something that nobody is born knowing how to do. It's a social skill, and a lot of it is learned through social modeling. And so as dating has become less common, broadly speaking, people have lost the kind of skill. It's like the muscle memory of society of teaching people how to date has sort of broken down. And so what they default to then is hooking up. But a lot of them don't like it and would prefer to date. So very interestingly, what Cronin came up with in her dating and spirituality class was actually a dating assignment. And I mean, if you're really interested in this, it's a really cool documentary. You can go rent it on Google Play, I know. You can probably rent it on another platform as well. I just haven't looked. It's called The Dating Project, and she actually sets some really interesting parameters around dating, like asking someone out on a first date. And I was going to give you this assignment. I was going to steal it off of Cronin, but obviously in the time of coronavirus, sending people out on dates sounds like a pretty terrible idea. Plus, where would you go? Because all the restaurants and cafes are like half closed. But basically outlined in this way. Okay, so you have to ask the person out in person, right? No texting, no social media. Have to go up to them and ask them out on a date. And if they say no, you accept it and you move on. And here, one of the criteria was you had to ask that person out on a date within 2 weeks and go on the date. Well, basically go out on the date within 2 weeks, or you failed the assignment. Okay, so that was part one. You had to have the date somewhere in public, and not a movie, right? So cafe or dinner, somewhere where you could talk to the person. the date could only last 90 minutes. And the idea here is, you want to leave people looking for more, right? If it's going really well with a person, leave them wanting a little more, right? Step out of the date before things get too good, or they've heard too much about you, or just spent 4 or 5 hours together. So 90 minutes. There could be no drugs or alcohol involved, so no drinking, right? And again, this is to, not to grease the skids of your kind of anxiety or whatever it happens to be. If you're going out on a date, just be present with the person. You were to prepare for this date 3 to 4 topics of discussion or questions to ask the person, but not too much more than that. If you burn through those 3 or 4 pre-prepared discussion items, well, the date, and there's nothing else to say, well, the date's probably not going good, so there's probably not going to be a follow-up one, so you don't have to worry about it. And you don't want to have like 50 questions, because that's just leaning into that anxiety. So 3, 4 questions, and the date had to end after 90 minutes with nothing more than an A-frame hug. Right, so you kind of lean in, both people lean in, it makes an A-frame, and you go off from there. Okay, so that was the kind of outline of the dating assignment that she gives, and I was going to give you if you wanted to do it as an optional assignment, but obviously that died, along with in-person classes. Okay, so this was her kind of solution, and again, if we had had time in class, it would have been nice. We would have watched a little bit of the dating project, and you would have seen that people really enjoyed this assignment, and her class has become, it's small, but it's super popular at Boston College. Okay, so hookup culture, just as prevalent on Catholic as on non-religious public and non-religious private campuses. So basically, this is from Freitas's research again. Most students at these colleges, so Catholic, public, private campuses, basically, when they were asked about the relationship of religion and spirituality and sex, they basically couldn't think of any way that the two related to each other. If they were religious, most of them would answer that they knew their religion taught something about spirituality, but that it didn't really matter because those teachings about sex were outdated, they belonged to a different time, they were unlivable in the present, and some prevalence of this. Basically, they couldn't see how religion and sex basically went together. Some prevalence, in some people, the feeling that sex pulls you away from God, that having premarital sex, kind of took you away from God, though this was more kind of prevalent at evangelical schools. Okay, so I'm going to end the lecture here, and what we're going to do, I'm going to pick it up in another lecture. We're going to talk about purity culture, and we're going to talk about kind of the experience of people at these particularly Catholic colleges and their experiences of sexuality and how it relates to their Christian beliefs. Okay, so what Freitas says is from her study again of these 4 different college types and these 1,230 students at these different colleges, was that Catholic college students at Catholic colleges basically said 3 things: that the Catholic Church's strict prohibition on sex and birth control are outdated and archaic, that saving sex for marriage and procreation was an unrealistic expectation. And basically, they had no real sense that the Catholic Church's teachings had any relevance about sex, even if you were married, right? That they didn't really feel like the Catholic Church had anything interesting or useful to say about sex at all. But even more so if you were unmarried. If you were unmarried, it was completely irrelevant what the Catholic Church said. Students really didn't know, like they couldn't put their finger exactly on where they learned about the Catholic Church's teachings. No one, it seemed, had really sat down and explicitly taught them what the Catholic Church had to say about sex. And most of them, she says, had incorrect or simplistic views of what the church teaches on sex and really had no idea why the church taught about sex what it does. And I mean, I can relate to this as well. I had a student who basically, came and talked to me. They were doing an interview for one of their other classes, and they just wanted, kind of a perspective of what the church teaches about sex. And I told them, kind of in natural law to mystic sense. And this is someone who had grown up in the church and basically said, wow, I had no idea. Like, I always thought it was just that you shouldn't use, birth control because, birth control makes it easier for you to have sex. And having sex before you're married is bad. And so the church doesn't want you to use birth control. And of course, well, this isn't the place for me to tell you the Catholic Church's position on birth control. The Church's teaching is, of course, much more complex than this. But most people, and I think young Catholics, simply have no idea the reasons the Church teaches what it does. And you can agree with those or you don't, and that doesn't really matter. But in order to really disagree with them in a profound way, you basically have to understand what it says. And so it's kind of shocking in a sense that the Roman Catholic youth just had absolutely no idea. And basically Freitas says that most of them just scoffed or laughed at the idea of the Catholic Church having anything useful to say about sex. And some of this was related to the idea of a celibate priesthood and what could a celibate priesthood possibly have to offer. But just not knowing what the Church had to say about sex and having been told, I think, that Church teachings on sexuality are so irrelevant, is basically that was the beliefs that people took away from it at the end of the day. So in her discussions with Catholic students, she says that not a single Catholic student mentioned a single Catholic document in their discussion of Catholic teachings on sex. So this was including 1968's Humanae Vitae, the encyclical wherein Pope Paul VI lays out explicitly why the Catholic Church is opposed to contraception. They might have known that the Catholic Church was opposed to contraception, but they had certainly never read Humanae Vitae, and most of them had never even heard of Humanae Vitae. They didn't mention, the church family in the modern world, where some of the teachings on family formation and the role of sex is further kind of elucidated by Pope John Paul II. They had certainly never heard of things like the theology of the body, John Paul II's enormously complex and heralded in a lot of circles treatise on the body and sexuality. None of them knew the teachings from Thomas Aquinas and the very Aristotelian sort of natural law arguments about the role of sexuality. Most of them had never even heard of Summa Theologica, which is the single most important theological document in the history of Roman Catholicism, and most of them couldn't have told you what it was if you asked them. And even, like the Catechism of the Catholic Church, they didn't know what the teachings were specifically. Again, they offered caricatured views of them. And even popular level sex books like Christopher West's Good News About Sex and Marriage were completely unknown. They basically didn't know at all what the Catholic Church's teachings were on sexuality or any place that they might hope to find such information. So the conclusion that Freitas comes to, and she's very frank about this, and surprisingly so, is that basically, if the Catholic Church has something of value to offer the discussion of sexuality in the modern world, it is doing an extraordinarily bad job of communicating its messages. Obviously, I don't think that in a world that basically pushes young people to have sex as quickly and as often as possible, that young people are likely going to flock to the Catholic Church's sexual teaching, even if it's well explained. I don't think that's the case at all. But at the end of the day, I think what we can say is that Freitas' research suggests that the Church has done such a poor job of communicating what its sexual message is and why it thinks sexuality should be treated the way it does, that young people broadly don't know what it is, don't know where to find it, and tend to just equate the Catholic Church's view of sexuality with a sort of quaint old-fashionedness that comes out of the Middle Ages. And it is, of course, much, much more complex than that. There are some tremendously complex, tremendously well thought out arguments within Catholicism about the role of sexuality, about premarital sex, about all of these things. These are things that have been carefully considered by very intelligent people, but frankly just not communicated. And there's a journalist by the name of Rod Dreher, and he was a kind of young adult convert to Catholicism, and one who, by his own admission, struggled kind of with his sexuality, with not wanting to be sexually active, but knowing that was not something that he could do as a new Catholic. And what he says is that he could hardly ever find any support for this within the Catholic community. No one wanted to talk about it. Most priests seem frankly embarrassed to talk about the Catholic Church's teachings or to provide any kind of support for unmarried people trying to live out the Church's teaching. And I think that's an experience that a lot of young Catholics who want to be faithful potentially to the Church's teachings could probably relate to. Where there are discourses, talking about sexuality, a lot of them are aimed at married couples and specifically, questions of using contraception. So a lot of the energy of kind of the Catholic Church and para-church organizations has been towards promoting things like natural family planning. So basically like techniques so that people can still have sex but not get pregnant and not use birth control. Very little is really aimed at unmarried young adults. And again, there seems to be like an embarrassment about this. So yeah, I mean, the teachings certainly aren't landing, but part of that seems to be because no one knows what the hell they are. And this is a tremendous failure of communication by the Catholic Church, which maybe has something to add to the story. But how can you have a dialogue and how can you be engaged in dialogue if no one actually knows what you believe beyond the sort of base caricatures that people tend to kind of toss around? So according to Freitas, basically most of the students at non-religious colleges, though they probably knew what their faith communities said around sex, a lot of them just didn't feel strongly enough about their religious beliefs to apply them, right? They're loosely religious. They're not quite nuns, but they're maybe moralistic therapeutic deists, or they're just not terribly engaged in their faith communities. And so, sex and religion, well, I know what my faith says about sex, but I'm not going to really live it. Religious beliefs were kind of compartmentalized. That's one part of my life, but it doesn't apply to the other parts. So people live this almost dissociative kind of identity with regards to sexuality. There's no real social support for those wanting to live out a religious conviction about sex. Most religious communities, frankly, just don't want to talk about it and just sort of want people to be, chaste or whatever, but don't want to really, create any structures or talk about it. And added to that, right, in youth culture, tremendous pressure to be sexually active and a normalization of sexual activity and early sexual activity in pop culture. So you kind of get what you get with that. And this was one of the problems, right? People were aware of their religious teachings, but it wasn't easy to apply them. And even people who wanted to found no support for doing so. So Mark Regnerus, who's a sociologist at University of Texas at Austin, basically classes, in terms of a typology of religion and behavior around sex, class people into these categories in a book called Forbidden Fruits, which is about religious teenagers and sexuality. Okay, so basically, these 5 categories. Intentional religion, again, he's doing alliteration, so he's using all I's, which I wish I was clever enough to do this, but I can never quite figure out how to make this happen. Okay, intentional religion. Right, so basically religion influences the actor's behavior and the actor's aware of it, right? So basically, like, I know what the religious beliefs are and I act on those religious beliefs and I say that I'm acting on those beliefs using religious language. Invisible religion, this is kind of similar to Thomas Luckman's category. Religion influences someone's behavior, though they're not aware of it and might not frame it in that religious context or deny it in that religious context. So here, I mean, I think what you can basically say about this is that it might be like values passed down from parents, but people might not know where it comes from, might not know that it's explicitly religious, and probably wouldn't say that they're doing it because of religion. They might be doing it because of other social pressures. So if you want an example of this in pop culture, I think Jane the Virgin would be a great example of this in pop culture, right? She's not sexually active, not for religious reasons, but because her abuela has religious reasons for not wanting her to have sex before she's married. Okay, so that's invisible religion. Inconsistent religion, right? So basically, it's kind of on and off. It doesn't influence the actor's behavior, but it might be like someone who maybe struggles, like would want to be, chaste, but struggles to make it work within their actions, right? It's relevant. They feel it should influence their actions, but they have trouble with it. So it doesn't influence their behavior strongly enough. And here, someone, you might think of someone who is, wanting to live out their religion's teachings on sexuality, but kind of fails to do so, right? Either they have sex with their girlfriend, and there's lots of examples of this, or girlfriend or boyfriend. There's lots of examples of this in Freitas's book, or, someone who chronically uses pornography, though he knows that it's something that is against their religion's explicit teachings, but has trouble kind of applying that. Okay, irrelevant religion, right? Religion doesn't influence their behavior, and they're aware of the religious claims, but they don't give a crap about them, right? So basically, it's not relevant to them. So religion is there, they know what religion says, but they don't care, right? So a lot of the college students that I was talking about in the last few slides are probably in that category, right? It's like, I know what it says, but I don't care. And then irreligion, right? They're not religious, and so religion has no bearing on their sexual decisions whatsoever. So I like this quotation, concluding kind of talking about religion and sexuality in kind of a faith context. Most college students seem to encounter sex and religion as if they're two powerful and jealous gods. When they interact, as they do among evangelicals, it is a battle to the death. And we'll talk about evangelicals next time when we talk about purity culture. All right, so basically what Freitas says is experiences of all four college types are alike in four ways, right? So students who are religious are really invested in their religious or spiritual identities. They experience sexual desire, right? Because they're human and they've passed puberty, so they experience sexual desire and they want to act on that desire. Romance and experiencing fulfilling romantic relationships are a priority, and they don't know how to reconcile these three things, right? That basically, the teachings of most religions on sexuality, which says wait till you're married, that is one thing, they're aware of it. They experience sexual desires, they want to act on it, and they want romantic relationships. And then, often those sexual desires end up being lived out in hookup culture. And so they want romantic relationships, and it's a priority, but these things don't necessarily line up in a very good way. So they're very competing, very strange priorities. Right, so kind of to conclude, sexuality for most students with a religious identity, Freitas thinks it's a struggle, right? That it's a deep struggle and a complicated one, and that in a kind of late modern context that emphasizes sex as often and with as many partners as possible, sex as casual, free, and meaningless, and religions that stress quite the opposite. It's a complicated task of reconciling those two things, and the desire often to live in the kind of free culture and to be part of culture, especially youth culture that prioritizes sexuality, versus knowing what the religions say, and feeling that those things sometimes are important, but not knowing quite how to put them together. So 4 kind of points that she makes, and we'll kind of end here. People in college in particular are anxious about sex, right? They report degrees of shame, regret, and angst about sex. Sometimes shame for having done it, regret for having done it with the wrong person, angst, they want to do it, or they feel like, they've done things wrong, and lots of different reasons. There's tons of different reasons, and they're as various as the people who are involved in these relationships. They think romance is asexual, right? There's this idea of romance as different from sex, which is, and if you remember from part 1, their ideas of romance are surprisingly asexual. It's long walks on the beach and this sort of thing. And that's what they want, right? They want romance. They don't know where to turn to for advice on sex, or if they can turn to anybody, right? The religious communities, like I've been talking about this lecture, are pretty useless when it comes to talking about sex and sexuality. And reconciling sex with their religious and spiritual identities is not just difficult, but it's rare, right? It's the rare student who figures out a way of reconciling the two things. And I think that's tragic, because obviously it means that spiritual leaders are not doing a good job of figuring out how to make these things go together.